I am such an awesome guy. I make so many videos.
Hello there, Price of Reason here with a movie review. In 2021, when it was announced that Warner Brothers would produce a prequel of sorts to the classic, iconic movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, I immediately had some serious reservations. For starters, this new so-called prequel wasn't relying on any of original author Roald Dahl's books, but rather on modern-day Hollywood writers. In addition, the original movie is today considered such a timeless classic that I couldn't really see how a new production would top it or even add anything meaningful to it. Still, as a movie critic, I always have to keep an open mind. Perhaps with the right people involved, with the right creative team, anything is possible. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the general plot of Wonka, what I didn't like about this movie, what I did like about this movie, followed by my official score. The movie starts off with Willy Wonka arriving in Europe, hoping to open his own chocolate shop. With no money and nowhere to live, Wonka ends up being taken in by an evil couple that owns a hostel and a laundry shop. It turns out, though, that this couple actually takes advantage of people by drowning them in debt, which they then have to pay back with never-ending labor. In addition to Wonka being under their thumb, the three biggest chocolatiers in town, known as the Chocolate Cartel, see Wonka and his magical chocolates as a threat, so they want to dispose of him by any means necessary. And at some point in the movie, it also turns out that Wonka has an unsettled score with an Oompa Loompa because Wonka once stole cocoa beans from his people. And throughout most of the movie, Wonka is accompanied by a little girl who's an orphan that is also controlled by the evil laundry shop owners. And as the movie progresses, it turns out that the little girl just might be the key to everything. Can Willy Wonka overcome all the odds and successfully open up his own chocolate shop? Let's start with what I didn't like about this movie. One of the most important things about a movie is to deliver a first act that really draws you in. Unfortunately, something about the first act of this movie doesn't really appeal to me. Sure, it has some quirky things happening in it and a bit of dark humor, but somehow it mostly falls flat and its pacing feels rather slow as well. The second act starts pushing the narrative forward in a slightly more interesting way, but it's also rather drowsy in its storytelling. Only the third act of this movie is actually decently executed when it comes to the narrative and pacing, but it's really tough to make it there, and I was genuinely surprised that I hadn't fallen asleep prior to that point in the movie. And I don't think anybody would have blamed me if I had, as the first 90 minutes of this movie are very boring. Another issue with Wonka is that rather than being a standard movie with a few memorable songs in it like in the original, this movie is much more of a musical, and honestly, I think it leans too heavily into that aspect. As if the writers couldn't think of a good enough story to tell, so they just said, "F*** it. Let's just do a bunch of show tunes." To make matters worse, with the exception of the original classic Oompa Loompa song and Pure Imagination that appear in this movie, most of the new original songs, composed especially for this movie, are rather forgettable, and there's also too many of them. As far as modern day messaging goes, I think this movie certainly has it, but it doesn't necessarily feel as heavy-handed as some other movies I've seen in recent years. There are figures like a police chief and a priest which are presented negatively, and I suspect that it's by design, but since these characters are presented in a comical way, it doesn't necessarily feel very mean-spirited. I also think that this movie takes some significant historical liberties, as I highly doubt the population in 1930s Europe, when this movie seemingly takes place, would be as diverse as what we see here. And yes, that includes the character of Slugworth, who in this movie is more diverse than ever. I suppose that given the fantasy musical nature of this specific movie, it may be easier to suspend disbelief here than in other movies, but personally, I usually like to see more historical accuracy when it comes to the casting of period pieces, even if they are fantasy-based. And if the producers of this movie so desperately wanted the population here to look like it does in 2023, perhaps they could have just made a completely different Wonka movie set in present day. That would actually make much more sense to me, especially since this movie isn't based on any source material, and doesn't even act as a real prequel to the original movie anyways. Still, the most agenda-based part of the movie that did actually annoy me was the alteration of Willy Wonka's history with the Oompa Loompas. In the original movie, it's explained that Wonka actually helped the Oompa Loompas, saved their community, and gave them jobs at his factory. In this movie, this same backstory is altered to have more of a white male colonizer stealing resources from indigenous people vibe, which I don't prefer. By presenting him as a thief, it basically makes Willy Wonka look bad, and while it's not something that really weighs down on the movie, I still think it's disappointing. More than anything, I think my biggest issue with the movie is actually the casting of Timothée Chalamet as Willy Wonka. Now I know that within the talent pool of his generation of actors, Chalamet, on paper, at least has some talent and does have some qualities that are seemingly right for this role. But while Chalamet can sing and dance, and isn't the worst actor for drama, he simply isn't capable of filling the big shoes of late actor Gene Wilder, who was the original and iconic Willy Wonka. And in my opinion, one of the reasons why the original movie is still considered so timeless. Like Chalamet, Wilder could sing, dance, and act, but his strong comedic timing was far superior to Chalamet's, giving Wilder more of an edge. In addition, Wilder also had much more natural on-screen character, charm, and personality that really resonated with viewers. Just to put things in perspective, most actors would be happy to have one iconic role in their career, but in addition to Willy Wonka, Wilder also had iconic roles in The Producers, Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, Silver Streak, and more. Wilder also knew how to improvise and come up with his own unique character ideas on set. For example, the now classic iconic scene where the original Willy Wonka makes an entrance using a cane which he doesn't actually need was entirely Wilder's idea. He had suggested it to the movie's director because he thought that after seeing it, viewers wouldn't know if they could trust Wonka or not, and that it would add a bit more mystery to the character. That's the type of added value that Wilder had brought to all of his roles, and with all due respect to Timothée Chalamet, I just don't think he's in the same league as Wilder as a performer. As a result, I think that Chalamet simply doesn't have that type of on-screen presence to really make the role of Wonka his own. The movie already isn't well written, it's too polished and it's too safe, and as opposed to Wilder, Timothée Chalamet just can't seem to break that mold. On a side note, Chalamet also seems really skinny. I don't know if it's because he's dating a Kardashian and maybe they only eat tofu and shit, but he seems like he certainly could gain a few pounds. If I had to point out a bright spot in this movie, I would say that it's Hugh Grant's performance as the Oompa Loompa. Even though physically, I would have preferred it if they had cast an actual little person actor in this role, just like they did in the original movie, I still think Grant adds some much needed character and cynicism to this movie, which is something that it sorely needs. Overall, while I could recognize that this movie was competently produced, I couldn't say that I walked out of the theater thinking that I genuinely liked it. And more than anything, I just felt that Wonka was a very unnecessary movie. Prequels are always going to be difficult because you already know what came afterwards, and unless you have something really interesting to offer, a prequel is usually going to disappoint. And the fact that this isn't based on any source material, that it doesn't connect with the original movie, that it's just a bunch of people singing and dancing, and that the Wonka character is kind of a somehow, it makes this movie a very snoozy and annoying affair. If I had to give this movie a score where anything below 60 out of 100 is considered a failing grade, I suppose I would give this movie a 50 out of 100, which means that it fails. I mean, if you especially like musicals, maybe you'll somewhat enjoy it, but to me there's nothing about it that leaves a real impression. It feels at times like a movie written by a committee without much heart or soul, and it doesn't really expand the world of Wonka in any meaningful way. And without Gene Wilder or an actor of his caliber, it has more of a professionally produced fan fiction feel to it than anything else. I did notice that more people have been watching my movie reviews lately, and I wanted to thank you for that. If you enjoy what I do here on this channel, please consider subscribing and also clicking on that wonderful notification bell. Thanks for watching, my friends. Thank you, and good day.
I am such an awesome guy. I make so many videos.